Welcome everyone to session 3 of our partner training webcast series. I am Stephen Walsh. I'm the product manager for the Notes Migrator for SharePoint product at Quest. Today we're going to be talking about advanced content migration jobs. So really a continuation of what we talked about in session 1. And as we were planning out session 3, what's going to be an advanced content migration job, we realized we had way too much stuff. So as some of you hopefully know, we've added another session at the end to have even more advanced content migration jobs. So that's going to be going on December 19th and 20th. So what we did is we took some of the content like document sets and migrating to publishing pages and web part pages, and some of the info path content migration parts will be moved over to session 7. And we still have a really packed session 3, lots of stuff in here, and in a way it's kind of one of the most fun sessions because we are talking about a lot of the things that don't always get into the big customer pitches and the big presentations, and even some of the shorter workshops that we do, because a lot of details in here that often show up in support cases, things like that. So how to deal with the weird things you're finding in notes, response documents, multi-valued items, and things like that. So there's kind of a good variety of things, but all pretty good stuff to know if you're out in the field doing real-world migration projects. And I will mention once again that we're using the beta version of Notes Migrator for SharePoint 6.1 for these demos, and I'll always try to point out what's a new feature. Almost everything I'm going to be showing you is available in the shipping version 6.0, which you can download off the website now, but if you prefer, you can always get into our beta program and start playing with 6.1, and that is due to release in January of 2012. So first thing we want to talk about is a concept of taking control of the metadata that's going into SharePoint. So our tool works with a lot of different kinds of notes metadata, and mostly we just pull this automatically and you don't have to do anything about it. So as you know from session 1, you just check a box and we'll migrate the created by name, the modified by name, created date, modified date. Or if we're doing document level security, we'll migrate the reader names and writer names, and we just know where to go into a notes document to get this stuff out. And then we pull out the document universal ID and the parent ID when we're doing things like keeping track of versioning, what's a duplicate document, how do we match up a parent and response in a discussion thread, and things like that. Now, what many people don't know is that you can actually take some control over all of this. You can, for example, if you have some piece of notes data that you'd prefer to use instead of the true notes author name or the true last modified name, if you have some piece of data that you want to be used to become the new author name, you can just put one of these override fields in your source data definition, and you don't even have to map it to anything. You just go into your source data definition, take some piece of data, or you could write a formula, and then you could say, I want that to be my new document ID. And so in today's session, we'll show you a couple tricks that we do using this override metadata concept. So one of them I'll be showing you is we want to eliminate duplicates when we're migrating a lookup list, something that we're going to do a lookup from. We're going to, in order to eliminate duplicates, we're going to take control over what we consider the document ID, and then we'll eliminate the duplicate documents. And so you'll see an interesting thing there. And then we'll also be talking about how we can take our notes document, and when we remigrate it a second time, we can write a second version in SharePoint. Well, if you've got some way of expressing versioning in your application, you can do things like saying these two documents are really the same document and they're really two different versions of the same document. You can do that by kind of forcing the document ID to be whatever you want it to be. So that's a couple examples of how you can use this stuff. Now I want to talk today about the different kinds of things you can do with keyword fields in notes. So we talked in week 1 about choice fields, and I showed you some examples of how we can provision a choice field or migrate to a choice field, and we can even add values to the choice field. As we're migrating, we'll add the list of legal values and populate that with the existing notes data. So today we're going to talk about lookup columns, and lookup columns are very similar to choice fields. As with choice fields, they can be multi-valued. The big difference is that with a choice field, the set of legal choices is actually stored in another SharePoint list. And this means you can have one list that populates all your vendor codes, and then you could have a vendor code field in another list that has a lookup into the big vendor code list. And that's of course more extensible. Users can add their own fields and so on. So many notes applications are structured this way as well. You have some other notes database or another view that has all your list of terms, vendor codes, product codes, whatever, and then your keyword field is a lookup in there. So typically you might migrate that to a lookup field. Lookup fields can be used to pull in other columns. So I may be doing a lookup of the vendor code, but that might pull in as a read-only column into my list say a vendor territory, something like that. As other pieces of data from the lookup list can be pulled down, and so this would be considered a join if you were a relational database person. Only it's done at the time that you pick the field. The lookup fields in SharePoint 2010 have some very powerful features for enforcing constraints. So now lookups can be part of your referential integrity between your documents. So if you have a field that has vendor names, you have a lookup list that has vendor names, and then you have vendor contacts. Vendor contacts can have a lookup field into vendors, and you could say this is a cascaded delete relationship. So if you delete the vendor, it's going to delete all the vendor contacts. Or you could set it up as a restricted delete. So you actually can't delete the vendor until you've gone in and first deleted all the vendor contacts. So two important, again, relational database concepts that SharePoint 2010 gives you now. So with Notes Migrator SharePoint, we can now provision lookup fields. And this is actually something that's new with version 6.1. With the previous versions, we could still migrate to lookup fields, but you had to manually create that lookup field in your list settings, and you had to configure it as to where the lookup list was. Now you can just provision that with version 6.1. We can do that automatically for you. Now, one important thing is that the lookup list must be pre-populated with all the legal values. So you've got to load up the list with all the vendor codes before you can refer to vendor, before you can migrate to a lookup field that points to vendor codes. And so this is often done in a real world migration by doing just a separate migration job. You run a simple migration job to populate the lookup codes field, and then you can run another migration job to populate all the other lists that use the lookup codes. So when you're migrating to a lookup field, you might be migrating a piece of data that is not a legal choice. It's not one of the vendor codes that's currently in your list, and so we'll either just log a warning and skip over that, or it'll be an error, and that depends on whether that lookup field is set as a required column. So if the lookup field says it's allowed to be blank, we're going to issue a warning and leave it blank. But if it's required, then we're going to get an error message, and you'll have to deal with that. You can either continue and skip that document, or fix the problem and start your migration job over. Now, one interesting thing that we did when we did provisioning in 6.1 of lookup fields, we actually realized that we can provision cross-site lookups. And that's something you can't actually do in basic SharePoint or even SharePoint Designer. It is possible to do it if you're writing your own, list definitions with XML, or if you're using the object model. And so we figured out a way to do that, and we thought that would be nice to expose that. So if you want to, you can use Notes Migrator for SharePoint 6.1 to provision cross-site lookups. So the vendor codes may be in a different site than the main list you're populating. As long as they're within the same site collection, we can set that up. So a cool little thing you can't do without writing your own code or using a third-party product. Now, related to lookup fields is managed metadata fields, and this was introduced in SharePoint 2010. And managed metadata fields are frankly very, very popular for notes migration companies. This kind of mirrors a concept that's been in the notes world for a long time, where you have a different database that's kind of your term store. You might have a whole database where all your vendor codes and product codes live, and then that database is meant to be shared amongst all the other databases, all the other applications. So in SharePoint terms, the term store is a very similar concept. The term store is sort of like its own standalone database, if you will, storing all the terms, all the legal terms for some particular type of field. So you might have a whole vendor code term store, and this term store could be scoped just to one particular site collection. So all the lists in that site collection could refer to this common term store of vendor codes, or it could even be scoped to the enterprise. You can set up a replication service between all your SharePoint servers in your environment, and all your farms in your environment, and you can you can share that vendor code list throughout your entire enterprise. So this is obviously a big deal for the taxonomy people who like to have a common set of vendor codes, product codes, and other corporate terms in their environment. The term store supports some other nice things like aliases, so I can have multiple terms that mean the same thing. We have translation, so I can store a French version of the term and a Spanish version of a term, and they all kind of mean the same thing, so they all come up together in a search, that kind of thing. And hierarchies. Term stores can have terms and subterms. So very common in the notes world to have, in the notes world we just use slashes to have category and subcategory and subcategory. And this is one way of doing that. Same kind of thing in SharePoint now is to have term stores which have a hierarchy. So if you're migrating to a field that has a term store, you still have to define that manually in your SharePoint list and then migrate the content. So there was just too many things we'd have to add to our UI in order to provision term stores for you. So we decided that you would still need to configure your term store in your list manually, create that column, and then we can migrate to it just fine. And while we're migrating to it, we give you a few different options. We can migrate using that. We can match terms using that hierarchy I mentioned. So if your notes term, like your category field or your vendor code field, has slashes in it, and you intend for those slashes to represent a hierarchy, we give you different ways where you can match that to your existing hierarchy, and I'll just show you that in a demo shortly. We can also match on the aliases. So if my notes terms are storing NMSP, and in my term store NMSP happens to be an alias for Notes Migrator for SharePoint, then we're going to match on that if you tell us to. And that's a nice way to kind of migrate some of the old outdated terms over to a new term store. Just throw on aliases on your term store that will match all the old terms you used in notes, and then after the migration job, those terms all mean the same thing, and you could even remove the aliases if you want to. They'll all just display using the main term name now in SharePoint. So very powerful there. And we can match on locale. So if you happen to know that one particular document library is storing all French terms, you could say I want to use the French locale for my term matching, and so I won't accidentally map to some other German word that happens to be spelled the same but it means something totally different. We're going to say we only want to match the French terms here. And then finally we can populate the term store. We can check a box in our tool and say if after all these matching rules fail, we can add that value as a new value in the term store. And so that's a nice easy way to populate a term store with all the data you have accumulated over the years in your notes documents. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to demos now. I'm going to start with a simple document library demo. So this is the same document library I was using in week 1. So if I look at my by category view, I can see, we have categories, North America, so on. We have trees, oak, and the category is just stored as trees/oak, trees/pine. So I'm gonna use a lookup field to store the category field in SharePoint. But like I said, the first thing I have to do is I have to populate that categories list with all these various categories. Now let's go do a migration job that does that. So I'm going to select that notes database in Notes Migrator for SharePoint. And by the way, I'm back to using the designer client like I was in week 1. In week 2, we'll use the migration console, and you can do all these migration jobs in the migration console, but I'm going back to the designer client just to keep it simpler. Let's pick this database. And again, this was just a standard document library, so I'm going to load the source data definition for my document library. Yes. And that includes, of course, the category field as well as the body field, the subject, and all that. So on the SharePoint side, let's select a new list where I want this to go to, and I'll just select, actually I'll select my main site, but I'll configure a new list. We'll call this test categories 1. And I'll call this 1 because I'm actually going to do this 2 different ways. So test categories 1, I'm going to create a new list, and for my target data definition, I'm going to create a new target data definition, and I only really want one column in here. So I want a column called category. Now, if you recall, in week 1 we mentioned this little feature right here is title field. Now every custom list starts by having a title field, and if I were to just add category as a new field, I still wouldn't be populating the title. So a good trick is to say I want category to be my title field. So we'll actually take the existing title field and rename it to category, and we'll migrate all the categories to that. So as you'll see in a minute, that's a much more satisfying result. I didn't set up my auto mapping, so I'm going to manually map the category field in Notes over to the category field in SharePoint. And I'm going to run this job. And as you can probably guess, if you've tried this thing before, we're going to have a problem once we get to the end here. And if I go to this list, we'll see what the problem is immediately. We've got all these repeats of categories, right? We got 4 trees/oak. So that's really not going to make a good lookup list for categories. So let's go back to our migration job, and I'll show you 2 different ways to solve this problem. So the first one will work with any version of SharePoint and any version of Notes Migrator for SharePoint. And the second one I'm going to show you will only be for SharePoint 2010. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go back to my Notes field, and I'm going to edit my data definition. And if I look at all my data fields, I've got my category field is coming from an item called categories. And I'm going to add a new column, only this time I'm going to put an alias on here. I want that column to be override document ID. And so basically I'm saying I want to pretend that the category itself is the unique document ID for my document. Therefore, when I have 4 different fields with the same category, our tool is going to think of that as the same document migrated 4 times. And so I can go here and I can say if duplicate document found, I want to skip it. So basically I'm only going to write the first one and skip all the others, and we're going to know it's a duplicate because it's going to have the same document ID. So let's delete the prior contents that I just did and run this again. Delete those guys, go to list, and there we go. We have our unique document ID. So that's one nice trick for eliminating duplicates of something if you're migrating. Just fake out the document ID. Now another approach here for SharePoint 2010, let's go here. I'm going to first remove that override column that I had in my source data definition, and then I'm going to provision a new list here. And one of the new features we have is the ability to run a job with just the provisioning parts. I think I mentioned this on week 1. So I'm going to go ahead and run the provisioning parts only. We're going to provision that list number 2. And let's go there. And if I go to my list settings, I have this category field again. And I'm going to turn on this SharePoint 2010 feature, enforce unique values, yes. And so if I do this, I won't be able to migrate the same category twice into the same field, because the category field has to have unique values. And it will tell me, yes, it needs to turn on an index, which is fine. And by the way, I had to make that change before I migrated any content. If I'd already migrated something with duplicates, it wouldn't let me make that change in the schema for the list. So now I've done that. Let's close some of these. And now I can run the full migration job, and I'm going to get an error here. So I'm trying to write record number 2, and I got an error. There's a duplicate. And so that's what I planned. I can say resume this task, look at the next error, and I can just uncheck this box if I don't want to see all the errors. So we're going to see a lot of errors here. So notice that we've written 7 documents, and we've got 33 errors, so the errors being the duplicates. And now if I go to this list, I got the same result now of a unique set of categories using that other trick. So now I can go ahead and migrate the main list. So I'm going to load in my data definition for custom list, and this is very similar to what I showed you before, only I want to call this test list 1, and in my data fields, this category field, I'm going to change this now to be a lookup field. And so, like I said, if this were Notes Migrator for SharePoint 6, I'd have to go manually set up this lookup field in the list, which is not really a big deal. You just got to go into list settings to do that. But I'm going to show you the new 6.1 feature where we can provision the lookup field for you. In order to provision it, we have these various provisioning options. So for my lookup target, I can use either one. I'll just use test categories 1 here as the source of my lookup. And then if I really wanted to, I could actually pick it from a different site inside the same site collection. But I don't need to do that in this case. And now the lookup column in that list, I want to be matching on the category field. And then if I had other things in that category list, like if there was an expense code associated with that category, I could copy that down with this additional columns thing, but there isn't anything interesting in this case. And then the usual things, do I want to allow multiple values, is it a required field, and so on. So I believe that's going to be enough now, or I can just go provision this list. It'll create the lookup field and then migrate all the contents. Let's see if I missed anything. Oh, there we go. So some of these have bigger attachments than others. Let's just go ahead into the list right now. And let's open this document. If I go into edit mode, I can see this is now a lookup field, and it's doing a lookup from the categories field list. So that's a nice easy way to do a lookup field. Now I'm going to show you one more lookup example a little later when we talk about normalization. So that'll be a cool demo we'll save for later. I also want to show you manage metadata. And just in the interest of time here, I'm going to show you an existing list where I've configured manage metadata fields. So if I go into my list settings here, I can see we've actually got two manage metadata fields, the category field and the products field. And so again, I had to configure this manually in my list. Our tool cannot provision this for you, but it's well worth the effort because metadata fields are very cool. So with a metadata field, I was able to bind that field to one of my term sets. In fact, I just created the term set on the fly when I configured this. There's an option to say customize your own term set if I was creating this for the first time. And you can see this term set is a site collection level term set, which means I just created it on the fly in this site collection. And if I drill down, I can see all my category fields. It's already configured with trees, oak, and so on. And in fact, I actually provisioned these using the data that was in notes, but I will show you another example of that in just a minute. Now, slightly different, this products one, this is coming from the corporate term store, called the product terms, and so I got products, SharePoint, Notes Migrator for SharePoint. I'm going to change my migration job now to go to this list. So I'm going to select this list that I was just showing you, a list with managed keywords, and I'm going to create a new data definition to go with it, and I'm going to use that feature. Instead of designing the schema for this list based on the source fields, I'm going to load it from the existing SharePoint site. So I've loaded in the schema of the SharePoint list. It pulls in some of these read-only fields we don't really need to migrate to. So, but most important, it got the category field, which it knows is a managed metadata field, and the products field, which is a managed metadata field. So here's where I could customize how I want to migrate this to. So in my options section, we have our hierarchy option, and I've got this set to, by default, to map last leaf only. And what that means is if my notes document says trees/oak, do I want to, when I'm trying to find an existing term, do I want to match on the full path of trees/oak? In this case, that would have worked. Or if I say last leaf only, it would match with anything that ends in oak. So maybe in notes it's tree slash oak, and I don't want to worry about the difference between the whole hierarchy. I could say map is last leaf only, and it would just match on the last part, the oak part. So this is a more liberal test, and I'm more likely to get a result. Of course, I may be more likely to get errors in some cases too. So if I want to be more precise, I could say map is a whole hierarchy, and that means that all the parts of the hierarchy have to match. Or I could say not a hierarchy, and in some cases you might have terms that happen to have a slash in it, but you don't really intend that slash to be part of a hierarchy, so you could just want to use the slash as a slash. And so we would match a string that was trees slash something. So I'll take that back to the map as last leaf. Match on alias is set to true, which means that in this case, if I had an alias NMSP, it would match with Notes Migrator for SharePoint because that alias is set up for this. And then if I wanted to here, I could specify the locale ID. So I forget what the locale for France is. It's a standard you can look up. 1033 is for US English, and so if I wanted to avoid accidentally matching against some Spanish term or some French term, I could put in 1033, meaning I'm only using English terms in this example. I'll just take the defaults here. And then this one says map missing terms. If there's any missing terms, add them to the term store, and I'm going to say true. And so just to prove that that's working, let's go and edit one of these documents, and I'm going to change it from new category to, let's just call it test category. So I would be expecting to add this to my term store of legal terms. So I need to come over to my map data tab, and I've already got from the last job I ran, I've already got my mapping of category to category. I need to map something to the products field, and actually I don't have anything in notes for the products field, so this is a good time to show you how to do constant mapping. So I can just say I want to map from none to products, and then here I can just put in a constant value NMSP. And again, it's going to match on alias, so we're hoping that NMSP will match with Notes Migrator for SharePoint. Okay, let's delete the prior contents and go ahead and run this job. Oh, I'm getting some warnings that it found multiple matches, so I could go look at those. Okay, let's go ahead and refresh this list. Now we've got a fresh set of documents in here. And if I edit this, I can see in the category field so the fact that test category is now one of the legal values in my term store is because I was migrating a notes document and I had that flag that says go ahead and add new values. And then NMSP migrated to Notes Migrator for SharePoint. So it's the same thing if I were to just type NMSP. You can see it found that term based on the alias. And then there's a lot of cool things you can do with these manage metadata fields. So for example, I turn on this little navigation here. I probably should have put it up top, but you can do a drill down, for example, on trees, and we'll just zero into the trees only. So this is the kind of thing that helps you avoid building lots of new views in SharePoint. So your notes application may have had documents for the Northeast region, documents for the South region, and as different views. So using these SharePoint features, you can do a drill down and avoid creating tons of views in your SharePoint application. Okay, let's get back to slides. So I want to kind of recap what we talked about with migrating notes keyword fields or anything that has any kind of lookup or set of choices in notes. So your three choices in SharePoint are pretty much choice fields, lookup fields, and manage metadata fields. And the biggest difference is where these things are stored. The legal choices are stored in the list schema in the case of a choice field, or in another list or in a term store. And in all these cases, they can be multi-valued. Interesting to note that lookup fields do not allow users to just add a new value on the fly, where you can enable that for choice fields and manage metadata fields. So for a lookup field, you'd have to force the user to go to the lookup list to add a new value. So it depends on your application whether that makes sense, but that's something to keep in mind. In all three cases, Notes Migrator for SharePoint can populate the choices based on the notes data that we're finding. Now, in the case of a lookup field, we had to do it as a separate job ahead of time, like I just showed you. In the case of choice field and manage metadata field, we can just check a box and say, yes, go ahead and add that to the list of choices or add it to the term store. And then term stores, again, have all these enhanced options of a hierarchy concept, aliases, translation, and a wider scope. It can be used against multiple site collections. Now, I showed you migrating a notes item over to these three columns, but don't forget you can use formulas to convert values while migrating. It's very common in a notes application that a keyword field is actually stored as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then that displays as north, east, south, west, whatever. So a good thing to do when you're migrating is actually write a formula that does the same thing, and so converts the 1 to north and 2 to east. And so keep that in mind, that you'll find that a lot in your notes applications. Okay, next topic is to talk about migrating files to alternate locations. So in all the demos I've shown you so far, when there was an embedded image or an attachment or an OLE object, that was just showing up in the attachments area. So all these list migrations I showed you, we're taking the defaults and we're putting them in the attachments area in the list. Even though we might be showing links to them in the rich text, really the attachments were in the attachments area. But you have a choice there. You can also decide, I'm going to place any or all of those things in a separate document library, and we still keep the links intact. So you may decide to put all the attachments in the shared documents folder, but we can still have the rich text field display the image in place and display links to the attachments icons in place inside the rich text. Now, if we were migrating to libraries, which I'll show you a little bit later, if we were taking each notes document and putting it in a library in some form, we have some choices here. Images, attachments, and objects would often be placed by default inside the same folder as the main document in that document library that you're migrating the main documents to. But again, you have a choice. You can choose to put them in a separate folder or a separate document library even. So for example, I'll show you later, we might be generating a bunch of Word documents, putting them in one library, but all the attachments inside the Word documents might be put into a different library. Your shared documents or your site assets library. And again, we keep all the links intact between the rich text parts and then the various pieces. Now, the way you would do alternate locations is in your migration job, in your target data definition, you set a column of type file, and then that file is something you can map your images or attachments or objects to, whereas you were formerly mapping them to an attachments construct in our target data definition. And the file column has properties called alternate folder and alternate library, and so you can set either one of those to kind of redirect these pieces to different places. And one of the things that's new in version 6.1 is that we can actually provision that alternate library for you. So usually you're using an existing document library like shared documents or site images or one of those, but if you want to, you can just type in the name, and then if you've turned on provisioning in our tool, we'll just provision that alternate library as a document library for you. Now, if you're migrating other properties like the category property or any other metadata properties, you can decide for each mapping whether that mapping applies just to the main document or to just the alternate documents or to both. Here's kind of a recap of some of your choices that you have regarding where you're going to put the images and attachments. So with a list item, you can put your images and attachments inside the main item, or you can put them in the alternate library, and the same with attachments and objects. If you were generating like Word documents, which we'll show you a little later, Word documents and PDF documents and InfoPath documents, the images themselves all go inside the document. We can only make them display nicely inside the rich text if you put the images inside the document itself. Whereas the attachments, you have a choice. For Word documents, you can put the attachments and objects in the main document or in the alternate library. In the case of PDF documents, you can't put attachments inside a PDF document. So a good thing to keep in mind as you're choosing which target you want to migrate a document to, PDF documents can't store the attachments. You're going to have to put them in an alternate library or an alternate location. If you're migrating to pages, nothing can be stored inside the page. A page can't even store an image, but it's very common to put rich text in a wiki page, and then it will display images out of an alternate location and have attachments in an alternate location. In fact, if you were to create a wiki page right now manually, you'd see that the rich text editor has a little button to allow you to upload an image or an uploaded attachment, and it will by default put it in a site images list or a site assets list or a shared documents list. So this is all very natural in the SharePoint world to have this concept of images and attachments go in these other document libraries, but they're displayed in these rich text areas. Okay, one more thing before we go to demos again. I want to talk about some of the control you have when you're mapping things. So you can decide to put your documents inside a folder if you want to, and I showed you this in week 1 where you could take any piece of notes data or some formula and map that to the folder name, and you basically create a target column of type folder, and then you can map text to it. So I could take the category field, map it to folder, and that would create folders with the category names. And if it's multi-level, if your category name has slashes in it, we will interpret that as a hierarchy by default, and we'll create folders and subfolders. If you don't want to do that, there's a multi-level property that you can set to false there. Many people don't know this, but if your data, like your category or subject, happens to have a slash in it, but you don't want that to mean subfolder, you can turn that off. One of the things to realize about folder creation is that we sort of create folders as a side effect of migrating the documents. So you're really creating a migration job for the documents, and we're creating the folders along the way and then just putting those documents in that folder. Now you can also control the file names of things. Now if you're mapping an attachment out of a notes document, that already has a file name, something.pdf or whatever. We'll preserve that attachment name by default. But for other kinds of things like embedded images, embedded objects, they don't always have implicit file names stored in notes. So we would generate names for you like image0.gif, image1.gif, image2.gif. If you want to, you can override that name by mapping some piece of data to a file name column. So just create a column of type file name and then map some formula or item to it. And by default, we're just going to assign it to things that don't already have their own file name. By default, it will just be for the images and attachments. If you want to really take control, you can set the override existing names property on that column, and then we're going to override the name to it even if it already has a file name. So we're actually going to change the attachment name, and we'll change it to whatever you want us to change it to, and we'll always preserve the file extension. So let's say you map subject to file name and you set override existing names to true. The attachment might have been called mycomments.txt. We're going to override it to subject.txt. So you get some control over what the new attachment names. Let's go into some demos again. And I'm going to start by doing a demo of that alternate location thing. So let's use that same migration job we've been working on here. And I can actually keep that same one with the managed keywords, but let's go into my data definition. And see, I have this attachment area here. So basically, I had an attachments column that we were mapping images and attachments to. And instead of type attachments, I want to change it to something of type file. If I wanted to, I could specify a folder or a library. In this case, I'll just use shared documents. I'm not quite sure why we don't have a picker here yet. Maybe we'll add one by the time we release. And I could do a folder. So let's call this demo files. There's a folder inside the shared documents. This is called attachments now internally, but it's really kind of misleading. So let's just call this files for the, let's just take that out. Okay, so we now have something called files, and it's going to put anything we map to it, because it's a type file, anything we map to the files column will go into the shared documents library in the demo files folder. And while we're at it, let's just add something of type folder. So name doesn't really matter. The important part is that it's a type folder. If I go to my mapping tab, clean up all the old ones. Now let's add a mapping of my attachments to this files area. And I also want to add a mapping of any images to the files area. And let's add a mapping of any embedded objects to the files area. And let's, while we're at it, let's even say I want to take something like the category and map it to folder. So now I'm going to create folders inside this list that I'm migrating to. Plus I'm going to put the images, attachments, and objects in this alternate library. I think I have my delete prior contents checked. So while that's running, let's go back to the top of this list. So now notice that we have folders. We have a trees folder, which came from the categories field. And if I go into oak, I can see some documents, but notice that none of them have attachments in here anymore. So if I open white oak, I can see that I still have an image here, but if I were to look at the properties of this image, you can see it's coming out of the shared documents library in the demo files folder. And similarly, here's an attachment link. This attachment really lives in this shared documents folder, so I can open it right out of there. So if I go into my libraries, shared documents, you can see this demo files folder has all my stuff, including all those files. Now notice these names here just have some, the notes ID.gif or whatever. These are all those embedded images and objects which didn't have any names. So if I wanted to get a little friendlier names here, I could manually override the file name. So let's go do that. I'm going to edit my target data definition. I'm going to add a column of type file name. And I don't want to change my attachments. If attachments already has a name, I want to leave it the way it is. So I'm not going to override existing names. So it'll only, if I set it to false, it'll only apply to those images and objects that don't already have a name. And let's just call this names. And then here's where that applies to comes in. I want this names property not to be for primary documents, but for the alternate documents. In my map data tab, I got to add a mapping of something. Let's call it, let's just take the subject of the notes document and make that the file name. So I'll map it to my names column, and now I'll run this job. Well, I don't even have to wait. Let's go back. I'm in my shared documents. So for this embedded image, we now gave it the name that equals the subject. And this OLE object, we converted this OLE object to an Excel file. We now gave it a friendly name based on the subject. All right. Okay, so back to slides. So next I want to talk about dealing with multi-valued items in your documents. You're going to find multi-valued items a lot in notes documents. You'll find fields that are of type text list and number list and date list. These are basically arrays. You don't have one number in this document, you have an array of numbers or array of dates, an array of text fields. And so SharePoint doesn't always have the equivalent to that, and that can be a problem. Also, if you write some formula, you can write a formula that results in a text list instead of a single text value. So that can be useful. It's very useful in the notes world, but it may be something to be aware about in the SharePoint world. So in SharePoint, you only have 4 different kinds of columns that can be multi-valued by default. Choice field, manage metadata field, lookup field, and user columns, you can just set a box in SharePoint that says that's multi-valued. Now, usually we'll just do the right thing there. In your source data definition, you should make sure that you're specifying multi as an option in your source data definition. So we're going to extract that as a multi-valued, as an array, as a multi-valued list. If you used our pickers, we'll probably set that for you automatically, but if you're not getting all your attachments, verify that in the source data definition you're specifying multi in the source column, and then of course you need to specify multi in the target column to go with your SharePoint schema. So for all those other column types, if you've just got a text field, you're going to have a choice to make. So if you have a text array and you're mapping to a single value text field, in our tool you can go to the mapping properties and you can say I want the first one, or I want the last one, or I want to merge them into one big string. And merge would just create one common delimited string. Sometimes people don't like our merge option. They want to just write a formula to control exactly how you're going to migrate things. So here's an example of a formula. The @implode formula is sort of a string concatenation thing, and we'll use a delimiter of comma with a space after it. So this is a little better than our merge. Our merge just does a comma. If you want a comma with a space after it, or any other kind of separator, or you may have other logic, you may want to reorder things or whatever. You can use a formula to control that, and then you map that to your single valued text field. Now, special case with text fields, you can in SharePoint have a multi-line text column, so it's still one string, but it has new lines in it. So here's an example where a formula could take a multi-valued field and create one string with new lines as the separator. So now you can map that nicely to a multi-line field. So this is particularly good if you have, some notes applications have like a little edit history that's a multi-valued field, and you want to map that over to just one big multi-line text field. You can do something like that. Now, for more complicated examples, you might want to actually do some normalization. So you might have an array of text fields, and you will actually want to break that out into multiple list items. And so we call that normalization, where you take one notes document and blow it out into multiple SharePoint documents. And so this is a new feature now with version 6.1, Notes Migrator for SharePoint 6.1, where you can now set the multi-value disposition in your mapping tab to normalize. And what we're going to do there is we're going to take all those fields that you normalized on, and we're going to look at how many values were there in the actual data document, and we're going to write out that many SharePoint items. And so it's a one-to-many mapping of one notes document to multiple SharePoint items based on the columns that you have set normalized on. So basically, we're going to, if you set this on multiple ones, we're going to take the largest array found. So I'll show you a demo in just a minute where we turn on normalize for 3 different columns, and whichever of those columns has the largest number of members, that will control the number of documents we write out on the SharePoint side. And then for any non-normalized columns you map to SharePoint, we're just going to copy them over and over again to every document. So this will hopefully become much clearer when I show you a demo, so don't worry if that's a little confusing. A common scenario is to actually run multiple migration jobs. You're going to run one migration job that migrates all the header records. So in the example that I'll show you, we'll migrate all the customer header properties first to a customer record, and then we're going to take all the detail columns that are arrays and map it to detail records in SharePoint. And you could often use a lookup column to keep those in sync, and so we'll do a quick example of that. Now, some limitations. First of all, this is only allowed for certain column types. You can't normalize based on a rich text field or generated documents and so on. It's actually only for custom lists, so you can't do this in a document library at all. And you can't use certain features of our tool that depend on knowing, what the one and only document ID is, one SharePoint document to one notes document, such as our automatic versioning, which I'll mention later today, and our link tracking service. We turn those things off if you do normalization, because we can't link to multiple documents. We can only link to one document. So hopefully that will make sense. Okay, so here's an example, which is the one I'll be showing you in the demo, where someone set up a form where we have the customer header information, and then we have our contacts listed up as an array. So this is a multi-valued text item, here for the title, a multi-valued text item here for the field. And so a typical document might look like this, where for this customer they entered 3 contacts, 3 contact names, 3 contact titles, and 3 contact phone numbers. And so it's just by convention, really, that this one kind of matches with this one, which matches with this one. But as you'll see, we're going to be able to break out 3 contact records, 1, 2, 3, and kind of match up all these values, because we're going to normalize these based on these 3 columns. Okay, so let's switch over to demos. Here's the database that I'm going to be migrating. It's the same one I showed you in the screenshots. So again, this is a text array here, which has 3 contacts. And if I open this one, you can see that we actually have a case where someone actually didn't enter stuff here. So they hit a new line here and started a second line, enter the phone number. They didn't bother to enter a third line. So we're going to want to see this matched up with this and 555 should go with that middle record. So that's kind of the intent of our normalization feature. Now, before we migrate it that way, I want to just show you some of the choices you have for multi-value handling here. So before I do normalization, I'm just going to do a simple demo where we just try to deal with the multi-valued items using some of the existing options. So let's go into our migration job, and I'm going to create a new job. Let's just say no to that. And I'm going to select that normalization demo, that same database. And here I don't have any data definition, so let's do a new data definition. And I'm going to select based on form used. So this is again a new 8.1 feature, sorry, a 6.1 feature of Notes Migrator for SharePoint. And you could really do this same type of thing manually, but it just has a little convenience to say I want to migrate based on the customer form. And if I do that in my fields picker, it's just a little easier to just pick the fields that are on that form. So I'm just going to pick all these fields that are on this particular form. And hopefully we've got our rich text area. We've got contact name is set to multi, so we did this automatically for you. But if we ever messed up based on, we're looking at the wrong notes form, or sometimes the form doesn't always indicate how the data is going to come out, you can always manually just set this to multi if you wanted to extract this as a string array, not just a flat string. So that's the source data definition. In the target side, let's select my site and pick contacts. I'll call it. I'll do customers first. Sorry, I'll do test customers, and I'm going to create a new list, and I'm going to have to add a new target data definition. So this will be a custom list. I'm going to say load from source field. So that's just going to copy the schema of my custom notes application over to SharePoint. And so notice here again that the title field, every custom list has a title field, but I want to remove that one, and I'm going to pick something else. I'm going to pick my customer ID, move that to the top, and I'll say I want that customer ID to be my title field, just because that'll be the thing I want to click on when I open the document. And my customer name, I'll put up top there. My contact, I'll move up. Sorry, my category, I'll move up. And then we don't need folders here in this case. So now I've got a nice schema definition, and as always I can pretty things up. I can say customer ID should have a space, and so on. Now I've got these three fields, and notice that they're defaulted to text fields, and text fields aren't multi-valued in SharePoint. So let's before I try to normalize these, let me just show you some simple experiments here where I can show you different ways to deal with this. So in this case, I'm going to take contact. Let's take the contact phone number and make that a choice field, and say because of the choice field I can say it's multi-valued. So that's one thing you can do with multi-valued items. Let's auto map everything. For the contact name, I can go to my multi-value disposition and say for contact name I want to just take the last one, and for contact title I'll merge it. So these are all the things you could do before normalization came along. These are some different ways people might choose to deal with multi-valued items. So phone number, we're migrating to a multi-valued choice field. Contact, we're just taking the last one. Title, we're going to merge them into one string. So let's just see what we get out of that. So we migrated those three records, and I made my customer ID into the title field. And so if I edit this, oops, I forgot to add the values. Sorry, I messed up. Let me go fix that. I said I wanted to make it a choice field, but I forgot to say I want to add all the values we find to the list of legal choices. So let me just fix that real quick. Refresh this. I did something wrong there. I'm sorry. Well, I'm not going to worry about that. The point is you can create a choice field. In the case of the contact name, I just picked the last one. And in the case of contact title, my merge didn't work either. Something's wrong with this job. Okay, here's one where the merge worked. I guess that's all we had in that other example. So here we chose the merge option for contact title. Contact phone, we put it to a multi-valued array, and contact name, we just took the last one. Okay. So obviously this isn't very satisfying, so we're going to now take it to the next level and do the merge thing. So let's go back to this migration job, and let's say I want to blow out those 3 different arrays into detail records. So what I'm going to do is now I want to migrate to a contacts list, and for my contacts list, let's edit this data definition. I want phone number to just be a text field again. I don't want to migrate the customer name or the category. Instead of making customer ID be the title field, I want the name to be the title field. And then we don't need the body or the attachments either. And for customer ID, I want customer ID to be a lookup into the header record. So let's make that be a lookup into the test customers list based on the customer ID field. And let's actually pull down an additional column. Let's pull down the customer name when I do that lookup. Oops, I forgot to check it. Customer name. And let's even set up a relationship behavior of cascading delete. So if I delete a customer record, it will automatically delete all the contacts that go with it. And then finally, let's just show off some of these other features we have. We have add to views, which is a new feature for 6.1. I think I mentioned that before, but I'll just add the name, the contact name, the contact phone number to the view. Okay. So that should be good. Let's fix up my mapping. So we're just mapping these 4 fields, and then again when we map the customer ID, it should kind of do that lookup in the customer list to get the customer name out of it. Okay, I think we're good. Let's run this job and see what happens. Oh, I didn't do the normalization. Okay, so now for this mapping for the contact name, I want to set the multi-value disposition to normalize. And the contact phone number, I want to set that to normalize as well. So we're basically going to treat these as arrays that break out into multiple records. For the ones that aren't normalized, we're just going to copy it to every document. Okay, now it should be safe to run this job. So let's go to that list, but notice that we read 3 records and we wrote 7 out. That's because we're doing that normalization. So I go to list here. We've made the contact name the title field, and notice that we did the right thing. Remember, the middle record for this particular, I didn't put the customer on here. Let me add that. Modify my view. I'm going to put the customer ID, customer name field. Let's make that at the top. Okay. So you can see my contact name is still the primary key, but we have a lookup into customer ID. So I click on one of these, it can actually go to that customer record. And the middle one out of this particular record, we set the contact phone to. So that's a normalization example, and it's a pretty powerful concept. So again, this is available in the beta version for 6.1, so we encourage you to get into our beta program and give us some feedback on all these features. Now another example you'll sometimes see out there is a notes form looks like this, where instead of a text array, you have individual fields lined up, and you can process these the same way. You could first write a formula in your source data definition to make an array out of these 4. So here's a simple formula that uses colons to make an array out of those 4 items, and you do the same for this one and another one here, and then you just normalize. Okay, so the next topic we're going to talk about is content types. Now, content types in SharePoint is another very powerful feature. It's been around for a while in SharePoint, and it allows you to have multiple types of documents inside of one list or library. So basically, you can set up a document type or content type called customer, and you can specify what the schema of a customer record is, what fields it has, and so on. You can also specify other things like workflow or forms that's associated with that particular kind of customer record. And you define these at the site collection level or at the subsite level, and then you can reuse it across many lists. And they even have a concept of enterprise content types now, where you can define a content type that you replicate across many SharePoint sites, so similar to the managed metadata feature. And when we get to the design migration talk, which is session 4, I believe, we will start talking about how we can provision, we can help you provision these content types now. But for now, let's just assume that you manually created your own content types. What Notes Migrator for SharePoint can do now is we can push content types that you've already defined at the site level into the particular list that you're creating. And we also have the option, kind of a separate option, to when you define a new column, you can push that new column into all the existing lists. So these are 2 6.1 features, and these are really just substitutes with something you could easily do manually by going into the site settings. You can go into site settings, you can push a content type to a list, or take a column that we provision and add it to all your other content types. But it's a nice convenience that we do this at provisioning time for you now in 6.1. And when you're migrating content, you can dynamically assign the content types based on the notes form now. Again, that's something you could always do. You could always do this other thing where you can assign content types based on some data value or formula, and that formula certainly could have been based on the form used, but now we just make that a more explicit feature. It's a little easier to use now in 6.1. So I'll show you, I'll do the demo that way using the new feature. And then you can also, with that applies to feature that I showed you before, you can restrict certain column mappings to certain content types. So you could say, I want the categories field to map, but only if we're mapping to a certain content type. Now, we also have some good support for discussion threads, and we've already talked about how we can migrate a standard discussion list in Notes to a discussion template in SharePoint. But that, when you really dig into that, it really relates to the content type features that I mentioned. So when we're migrating, Notes applications have a concept of response documents and response to response documents. And yes, that certainly applies to discussion threads, but it also applies to applications. So in Notes, I could have, this isn't the demo that I just showed you, but I could have had an example in Notes where I had customer records were the main documents, and then customer contacts were a response document to those main documents, and then you could have contact lists as a response document, contact call logs as a response document to your contacts list records. So this is very common in the Notes world to use a response hierarchy to associate customers with contacts with calls and things like that. So when you're facing this kind of application of Notes, you really have two main options you can use. You can migrate it to a discussion list, and unfortunately in SharePoint, unless you're going to go design your own custom list types in Visual Studio or something like that, the discussion template is the only template you have that has a built-in response hierarchy to it. So the main option that a lot of people look at is taking this application that had response documents and mapping that to a discussion list. And so you can expand the schema of this list to include all the additional columns. So just like I did for a custom list before, I can just pull over any columns I want to and add them to the discussion list. One caveat here is that by default we're just going to add those new columns to the main content type for discussion threads, which is in SharePoint is called discussion. Be careful about that, because one thing that happens sometimes is those fields don't show up in all the response documents, and so you have to be aware that the response documents are its own content type called message, and so you might have to manually go add those all those new columns that we provisioned over to the message content type. Now in 6.1 we make it a little easier for you. We have a little add to all content types flag, which I'll show you in just a minute. Now if you want to go even farther with that, sometimes people would actually create a new content type that's derived from discussion and a content type that derives from message, which has more control. I think it kind of it achieves the same thing in the end as just doing this, but you've kind of designed a content type that doesn't just say discussion, but it says customer record or customer contact. Now another thing that happens when you're with the discussion list is in SharePoint, the discussion list user interface is not really very Notes-like at all. It's as I'm sure you know, the discussion list user interface kind of shows a whole discussion thread in one big page, and that doesn't look at all like your Notes example where you had twisties that you drill down from customers to customer contacts. So people would often redevelop their view to have a much more Notes-like experience in the view. One way to do that is to use a different product, Quest Web Parts for SharePoint. It's really good. It has a really good threaded list, threaded discussion list component, which people love for doing things like when they're migrating an application like this to SharePoint, or even discussion threads for that matter, if they want to have a more Notes-like view of your parent, child, and so on in response documents. Highly recommended that you take a look at that. Now the other option is just to give up on the discussion list altogether and migrate these to a normal discussion list, and migrate these to a normal custom list. And that's going to be similar to the migration jobs I already showed you. The only catch is you need to figure out how you're going to relate the parent documents to the child documents. So you could use a data column, like a lookup column, like I just showed you, to correlate these to these and these to these. You can use lookup fields, or you can just invent some other concept. You can just have you can just decide the customer ID field is going to be the common field between customers and customer contacts. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a lookup field at all. It could be just any number of data fields that correlate the records. But make sure you think about how they're going to correlate and how they're going to link back even. You might use content types for that. You might put these all in the same list and use content types, or you might put them in different lists. Like the demo I showed you, I put customers and contacts in different lists. Now, before I go into demos, I want to mention this category of setting data values in SharePoint that didn't necessarily come straight out of Notes. So I already showed you the example of setting a constant. We had the source type was set to constant. I was able to just put in that constant value. Remember, I mapped a constant NMSP over to um, one of those managed metadata fields. You can also set the source type to something called target value. And if you set it to target value, that's really good for migrating URLs to other SharePoint documents into your list. So for example, let's say you're migrating a bunch of response documents and you want to put a link to the parent document in your SharePoint document. You can use this source value equals target and then set the target value to link to parent document and then map that to some URL field. Will automatically create URL links to the parent documents. And similarly, if you were migrating attachments to these alternate locations, which I showed you earlier, you can set up a link from the alternate file back to the parent document by using this target value structure and a link to primary document. So it's primary document instead of parent document here. Oh, actually that's a typo. That should say parent. That should say primary document. So let me show you some of these examples. So for the content types example, I want to show you a customer database that I have. Let's close some of these. This is a network service requests database, and if I look by let's see, let's just sort this normally. I can see we have different types of requests here. A batch migration request has a bunch of fields. I won't spend a lot of time worrying about the details of this form right now. I just want to make the point that we have different types of documents in this database. If I were to look at this in our analysis tool, we could go data analysis by form used, and we can see exactly how many of each of these we have. But we have work requests, we have production control requests, and these different kinds of documents. And so each one of these has a different set of fields and so on. And so in the interest of time, I've already created a content type. So if I go into my SharePoint list and go into my site actions, site settings, and look at my site content types, I can see I've defined a couple content types that just had the same fields. And I was really lazy here. I just took all the exact internal names I had in notes. If this was a real application, I might take some time to pretty this up quite a bit. But I just took all the fields that we had in notes and for a batch migration form and added them here manually. Now, in session 4 of this series, I'll show you how we can, as part of our design migration feature, not content migration, but as part of our design migration, I'll show you how we generated this exact content type automatically from notes. But right now, just imagine you created this manually. So we have the batch migration one and a work request one, and I'll just stick to those two content types now. So let's do a migration job. Let's do a new migration job, and I'll select that database, and I'll create a data definition for it. And I'll use my select based on form in this case, and because I just want the batch migration and work request documents, because those are the only two content types that I have so far. And for my data fields, I'll just quickly select all the fields that are in those two different kinds of forms. And again, if this is a real migration, I might be spending some time thinking about what I really want out of here, but I'm just going to be lazy and take everything. Okay. So now I've got my source data definition defined. And the interesting part is over on the target side. Let's select my site, and I'll create a new list. Test list 2. I think I'm only up to 2 now. And then we'll create this on the site. And in my target data definition, I'm now going to use this new feature here, and I'm going to turn on management of content types. So I'm going to add a content type. So this is all my site content types that I have defined on my site, and I'm going to say I want a batch migration content type, And I want to automatically associate that with the batch migration notes form. And I could have associated with multiple forms if I wanted to. Similarly, let's add another one where I take my work request and I'm gonna add the content work request content type that I manually created and add that to my list, and I'm going to associate it automatically with the work request form. So this is kind of a convenience, like I said. It's a new feature of Notes Migrator for SharePoint 6.1. If you're using the release version, don't worry, because this is pretty easy to just do manually in the list. Just add the content type to the list. And for this association, what you do is you just create a data column of type content type, and then you just map the notes form name over to content type, and that's another way you can set this. You can map any piece of notes data over to the content type. But here I'm using this new feature to automatically associate it based on form. So for my data fields, this button changed now because we're doing content types to load from SharePoint list and content types. And actually, we haven't created this list yet, so we're not going to be loading anything from the list. But we'll still load in all these columns from the content type. Now, if I look at these, I can see that this field right here, we've automatically set the applies to content type batch migration here. So this particular field is only going to be written into SharePoint if the content type is batch migration. I go up to this one, request ID is in all the content types that I picked, so notice that this applies to hasn't been set. It just applies to all the main documents. Now, I'm actually going to say actually this is already set up in the content types. We already defined that request ID should be the title field. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Go to my map data tab and auto map this stuff. I could always customize my mappings, but because we just did a one-to-one mapping, we can auto map it and everything will just work. So let's run this job. And you'll see some warnings come along about truncated documents here. So a text field in SharePoint is limited to 255 characters, and some of the things that I mapped to text fields were going over that. So again, if this were a real migration, I might be more careful, and I'd go, instead of mapping to a text field, I might map comments to, say, a multi-line text field instead of a single-line text field. But I'm trying to make the point about content types here, so I'm not going to worry about all those errors. In fact, let's just cancel this here now. We've written a couple hundred records. Let's go to that list. So my requester ID was the title field. Let's go modify my view and put a couple other things here. I'll at least put the content type on here. And I shall just do that. So we can see that some of these were work requests content type. So if I look down here, content type equals work request, and that dictates a certain set of fields that we're going to have that was defined for that content type. And batch migration requests would have a different set of fields, many more fields for batch migration requests. So once again, I didn't spend any time thinking about how this should look. I just wanted to make the point about the content types. And so that's actually pretty simple how we support content types there. Now I'm going to switch gears here and go over to a discussion list. And let's see, I thought I had one up here. Yeah, okay. So this is the Proposition discussion. This was actually our support forum that we had on the old Proposition website before we got acquired by Quest 4 years ago. So who knows, you may even see some of your comments there if you were a Proposition customer. If I go to my All Documents view, you can see that this is a discussion database with threaded discussions and responses and so on. Now, let's migrate this database. I'm going to close some of these down again. I'm going to do a new migration job. I'm going to select, go into my site subfolder and pull that old proposed and discussion database up here. And notice this wasn't flagged with a template here, so I'm just going to load a default data definition for a discussion list myself. But it will work just fine. It pulls out all the fields of a discussion list even though we didn't have the template name in the database. And on the SharePoint side, I want to select the site, and I'm going to say my list will be test discussion 1. And we'll create that, of course. And then I could do a couple things here. I could create a new data definition from scratch. We actually have a good starter discussion list. I'll just show you that example. I'll load the default template that comes with our tool for standard SharePoint discussions, and so that will provision this new list as a discussion. Not only that, when I go to my Map Data tab, I see I now have this box is enabled. I'm going to automatically preserve the response hierarchies. So when we pull out the notes data, we're going to keep track of the parent and child responses, and we'll redo that hierarchy. We'll re-provision that hierarchy in SharePoint with the same responses and children of children. And actually, in my SharePoint tab, I want to add a couple more things. I'll just to show you something different, I'll do the add right here. I'll show you I want to add a new field called category. And I want to map the categories field to that. And if I can edit this field in my target data definition, it's the same thing as if I had manually added it. In fact, let's do a load from source fields to get all the other fields. That's a duplicate there. Let's add the from field. Now, with these category and from fields, if I just ran this job now, I would only be adding these to the parent content type because that's what we do by default. So what I want to do instead is use this new feature, add to all content types. This is in 6.1, and I'll do the same thing here. So now this field is going to be mapped both to the parent documents and to the response documents because we know internally those are two different content types in SharePoint. And I could even get more fancy. I could say the from field, I want to say applies to only certain content types. And here's the content types in my list. Oh, I didn't provision it yet. Sorry. So I could say messages or message. But anyway, I'll just say in this case, I'll say all content types. Okay. So let's go ahead and run this job. I think I've got everything checked that I want. I'm going to create a new one. Let's go. Okay, I'm going to cancel this task and just go to the list with just 20 records. So I'm going to run this again with a change in just a minute. So here I think this is that first one we migrated, and here's the the default display of discussion threads in SharePoint. And you can see it's this one page that shows all the responses. If I wanted a different UI, I might throw in Quest web parts or design my own UI in SharePoint using standard SharePoint development skills. The important thing here is the properties. I can see the properties have the category field. Oh, I didn't do the mapping of the from field, so that's why I didn't provision the from field. But you get the idea. We added the category field not only to the parent content type, but the responses, which is in SharePoint, the message content type is for all the response documents. So let's go back to that job. Oh, sorry. And I will go ahead and add the mapping of the from field to the from field. But I also want to add another mapping, and I want to create a new field that's of type that's called parent link, and this is going to be a URL field. And then here's where I change that source type to target value, and I want to be a link to the parent document. So remember, parent document is for responses, primary document is for alternate things that are sent to an alternate library. I want to link back to the parent document. So I'll just do parent document. So notice how we're not mapping a source field here, we're mapping a target field. Something in so this is a value in SharePoint being mapped to a SharePoint field. So that's where that naming convention comes from. Look at this parent link column, add this parent link field to the response documents. I'm going to just do this again, and so let's go to that list. There we go. So this response document, let's say this response document came up in a search. Let's just say I did a search for some term here. This document came up. I could now see where did this come from. I can go link to the parent document. Okay, so now I want to talk about generating documents. We can generate Word documents and PDF documents and InfoPath documents. Today I'm just going to focus on Word and PDF. When you want to generate a document of type Word, you simply create a target column of type Word document, and you can use, if you want to, you can use it just as is. You just map things to that column and it just works. Or you can use a template editor that I'll show you, and you can actually provision this Word document column with your own custom Word template. And so you may have developed your own Word template that you want to use for all your generated documents. So what you do is you select the document properties you want to map to. This template might have special custom document properties, content controls, legacy controls, and you can decide which of these pieces of data you want to map to. So if you wanted to, you could map notes data to your content controls that you put on your Word template. When you do the mapping, for generated documents like this, we have a new notation, column.property, where the column name might be something like Word document. So it'd be Word document dot file name or Word document dot body. And so for this one column you've added, you have multiple things you can map to. So at a minimum, you always need to map something to the file name, and that controls what the file name of these generated Word documents is going to be. And you probably want to map something to body, so that document will have something in it. You can also map to the other properties if you want to. Now, a commonly asked question is, can I take multiple things? Like, let's say I have two rich text fields, or a rich text field and a plain text field. The answer is yes, you can concatenate multiple things to the body field. If you want to put them together as one big rich text Word document. And if you have other properties or controls, you can map those as well. Now, one thing about Word documents is that embedded images are always stored inside the document, so they just display in place inside the body of the document. Attachments, you have a choice whether you want attachments and objects to be stored inside the Word document or separately in an alternate document library like I showed you. And it's actually more common to store them separately. If you put the attachments inside the Word documents, what you'll find is that you might end up with some really big Word documents that take a long time to open. So kind of too bad if a 100K Word document has a 20 megabyte attachment in it, and all of a sudden it becomes a huge Word document that takes forever to open. So commonly people will take all the attachments and put them outside the Word documents, and then you could use things like that link to parent to kind of keep things all linked up if you wanted to. For PDF files, it's very similar. It's actually a little simpler even. You can create a column of type PDF document. There's a few properties you can set for controlling the page layout, but usually you'll just keep the defaults. And you don't have a concept of a custom template for PDF. We're just generating plain PDF documents. And so it has that same notation of mapping to column.property and so on. So again, you want to map something to the file name and the body at a minimum. And one difference with Word documents is that you don't have a choice here. Attachments cannot be stored inside a PDF file. They have to be stored separately. Okay, let's take a look at an example here. So let's do a new migration job. Go back to my trusty QDemo document library that I've been using. And yes, I'll take the defaults here. And the SharePoint side, I'll select my site. I'll create a test library one. We'll create that. And then I want to load a target data definition. I could just create one from scratch, but I'll load a target data definition. And then here's all the target data definitions that we have for document libraries. And so when we're putting notes documents in document libraries, as you'll see over the next couple sessions, we have a lot of choices of, I could put it in as a PDF document. In this case, I'm going to do a Word document. But later I'll show you how we can migrate to pages in a library, and so on. So here, my target data definition for the Word document library is very simple. I'll show that to you quickly. It has just this one column called doc, and that represents the Word document. We can call it anything we want. We can call that doc2 or anything we want. But basically, anything we map to this becomes a Word document in the library. And I'll even do that customization where I'm going to go to this Word template property and I'm going to customize that using our custom template editor. And I'm going to import a custom, I think I have my desktop here. I don't have any templates. I think I might have it as a docx file instead of a template. So I can import my Quest letterhead Word document. You can load a docx or a .x, which is the template. So now I can see I have more fields that I can map to because there's additional things that have been added. If this template had custom content controls or legacy controls, I would see those here as mappable fields, and I could just decide which ones I want to allow mapping to out of this template. But usually you just keep all the defaults. And you might, sometimes you'll have name collisions where you have a content control with the same name as a property. In that case, you might want to change the mappable name here so it's clear what you're mapping to. Okay, so now my mapping tab, I do my auto map, I can see that by default we're mapping the subject to doc.filename, but I could take any property I wanted to in Notes and make that be the file name of this Word document. Similarly, mapping various properties like subject, category, status, and then my rich text part is the HTML is mapping to doc.body, and that's probably the most important part. And I can map multiple things here. So let's just add one here just for the fun of it. Let's add another mapping to doc.property, only let's just make this a constant value, and we'll just say put a new line in there, and we'll say this is the end. So we should expect to see this at the end of our Word document. And so notice here, I'll just arrange things to make it clear. We're mapping two things to doc.body, and those will be concatenated into one Word document. And actually you can do this with rich text fields as well in a list item. You can concatenate multiple things into one rich text field in list items and in pages and in eTarget. Okay, that's probably good enough. Let's go ahead and run this migration job. We'll provision this library now. And we're migrating some documents, and without even waiting for it to finish, I'll just go to that list. And so here's a test library 1. It's full of Word documents. So if I open one of these here, you can see we've taken this notes rich text document, we put it in a Word document, only we used our Quest letterhead template here. And notice at the end we added that constant text. And there was actually a property I forgot to show you where I could have set the style for this custom text. And for the Word document, there's a formatting style property where I can say any custom text that I map uses this word style if I wanted to style this a little better. If I were to go to my properties here, this Word document, let's see, I'll say show all properties. I can see that I mapped my title property, my categories property, my status property, and so on. Some of these just came from the template. But you can see we've mapped a lot of things here based on notes data. Now, I purposely didn't show you any of this, but if you're a SharePoint Word developer, you probably know that you could also automatically synchronize some of these properties with SharePoint columns so they display in your SharePoint metadata. But I purposely didn't do that because I didn't want to confuse matters. As far as our tool is concerned, that's just something that happens on SharePoint. We can map things to the document properties, or we can map to the SharePoint list properties still, because every document here has document properties. Oh, sorry, wrong one. Yeah. So we can choose to map to either one, or sometimes you just automatically set up synchronization between the SharePoint properties and the file properties. And then PDFs are similar. I'll just, in the interest of time, I'll just show you an example of a PDF document. So here is a PDF document we created from that notes-rich text field. And if you remember what I showed you on week 1 when I talked about rendering, just to be clear, you can mix and match these. I can use that render option to render to a PDF document or a Word document or anything else. So here's an example where we did the rendering. Is it coming? So we rendered this PDF document with its original notes form, and so we got the layout the way it looked in notes, not just the big rich text field. So keep in mind when you're doing Word or PDF documents, you can always say render with form, and you can get that more original notes look and feel to those documents. Okay. So back to slides. I believe we're on our last set of slides here, last couple slides. So one thing I want to mention is working with approval codes. So SharePoint has a nice free approval process that you don't have to develop yourself. You just check a box in SharePoint, you go to Site Settings, Versioning, and Require Content Approval for Submitted Items. Once you turn that on, you get a free approval process in your list or your library. And so in SharePoint terms, it's, a document can be pending, rejected, and approved. Now, that's obviously a fairly simple workflow, but it's a nice one. It gives you a nice UI for changing the status and displaying things in views and all that. So it's also related to the publishing concept in some templates, like a wiki library would have a publishing thing. So unless you're an author, you don't see the document until it's been published, and so it's the same idea. Now, a lot of notes applications have workflows that are simple enough to be able to map over to this. They may have called it something else in notes. They may have called it publish status instead of approval status. But the point is that you can save yourself a lot of time and energy for those, for those notes applications that had fairly simple document workflows that could be mapped over to this concept. You don't have to rebuild anything. Our tool can just take the status, so however you represented that in notes, over to this approval process. So if you want to do that, you add our target column in our tool of type approval code, and then you can map notes data that represents the approval status. And you have to use the terms that SharePoint will like pending, rejected, and approved. And so here's an example of a formula that took a notes app that used to say published and unpublished, and it was a formula that says if the published status was published, then we're now going to yield approved, otherwise we'll yield pending. And so we've kind of mapped the way the notes app did it over to the way SharePoint wants to see it. And if you do that, you get nice approved documents in the list. So There are other kinds of workflows, of course, in SharePoint. A lot of your workflows won't be that simple as just approval code. I wanted to make the point that even though you might have to go design some more complex workflows in SharePoint, you might have to go into SharePoint Designer and design a declarative workflow, or in rare cases, you might even be going into Visual Studio and design an even more complex workflow. You can still use our tool to migrate the workflow state. Workflow state in Notes is just a bunch of data items like next approver, due date, status, and so using things like formulas like this, you can kind of translate all these fields in your Notes application to whatever your new workflow that you designed is going to look at. So let's say you designed a workflow that stores next approver in an item in your list, or at least when the workflow starts up, it'll look at that list item um, to go to the next day in the workflow. You can map these fields over. So people worry a lot about the fact that they have to rebuild workflows. It's actually not that hard to build workflows. In the Notes world, you had code-based workflows with agents and all that, but in the SharePoint, you're probably going to be mapping to a nice, simple declarative workflow that you did without any code in your designer tool. And again, you can migrate the workflow state. So finally, we want to talk about the duplicate document handling. Now, I showed you a really simple example of that when I set the if duplicate found to skip when I wanted to eliminate the duplicates for those category fields. But let me describe you more generally how the duplicate document handling works. So basically, when you migrate the same document to the same list multiple times, our tool will consider that to be a duplicate. And by default, we're going to be looking at the document ID that came out of Notes. So if it's a normal Notes app, that will be the Notes universal ID, which is a common thing in the Notes world. So if you migrate the same document with the same universal ID, we're going to consider it to be a duplicate. And this turns out to be very helpful if you want to run the same job multiple times. You might write a script that migrates the same job every night, and we can automatically detect that, okay, this is a duplicate of a document that we've already migrated before, and then we give you a lot of choices as to what you want to do with that. So for example, you could decide you want to skip it. If you've already migrated this document before, let's skip it, or let's overwrite it and blow away the old one and write a new one. We can write it as a second additional document if it's been modified before. And so when I say if modified, when we migrated that first one, we actually kept track of the timestamp of that document. So as a hidden field in your SharePoint list, we have the original Notes document ID and the original timestamp. And so we can detect if it's been modified since the last time you migrated it. And you can decide, I want to migrate a second one, but only if the user modified the first one. Or if you have versioning turned on in your list or library, you can say, I want to write another version of the document if it's been modified before. So just to jump back over here for a second, I told you that for Notes apps, by default, the document ID is based on the UNID in SharePoint, the universal ID, sorry, in Notes. But for QuickPlace and Quicker, as you'll see in a couple of weeks, those applications have their own internal document ID, so we use those to represent a unique document, and so we can automatically pull over the versions that's built in, the versioning that's built into SharePoint and Domino.doc. Sorry, in QuickPlace and Domino.doc. And I showed you how you can use override document ID to kind of fake out what you want to be considered as the unique document ID that will trigger these things. So an example might be if you have your own version control system you built in Notes, what is the identifier that defines a unique document? So two versions of the same document have the same whatever. Maybe it's a response hierarchy that you have in Notes, or maybe it's you've got some document ID that you invented. Go ahead and use the override document ID to kind of to map over what you want to call the document ID that will trigger two versions of the same document. Okay, so let's go into some demos one last time here. And I'm going to just stick with this same Word document demo that I did, and I'm going to just go over here and let's go into my notes application, and where's that? Some links. I'm going to actually edit this. I'm going to say now the category is back over to regression testing. And let's save this again. Now I want to re-migrate this document. I'm going to run this migration job again, only this time I'm going to say, I'm not going to say delete current items. I'm going to leave the existing ones there, and if duplicate is found, I want to create a new version. Now, in order for this to work, I better go into my SharePoint list. Let's see. I closed the browser there. It was libraries, test library 1, library settings, go into my versioning settings, and I want to say let's use major versions and keep track of version history in this library. So now I should be able to go to my migration job and run it. And okay, go back to my list now. Let's modify my view, my all documents view. Let's add the version number column to this view so we can see what's going on. And now hopefully if I find that some links document, you can see for that document we've got two different versions, so version number is 2. So we only versioned the ones that we had modified since we last ran the migration job. Oh, let's do it this way. Let's look at my version history. And so we got the two different versions of the document that could open. Now, if I wanted to go into the list settings again, library settings, go into my versioning settings and say require content approval. I'll go into my migration job now, and I actually don't have an approval code here, so I'm just going to, in the interest of time, I'll just show you the concept of how it works. I'm going to add a column to my mappings. Improve status, I can call it anything I want. The important point is that it's of type approval code. And I'm just going to map a constant value. I'll just make them all approved. But I could have obviously mapped some piece of notes data or written a formula and mapped that to this status instead. So this time I will just blow away all the old ones and rerun this. Let's just go right away to that list. And sure enough, that's just because it was in progress here. See, we write in multiple stages, so sometimes you can see this as going. Okay, so here's all of our documents, and they're all approved. Okay, well that concludes our content for today. Thank you all for joining us, and hopefully you're having a good time migrating things.